Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good to see everyone. I think we're in for a very special treat today. The Israeli-Palestinian issue has not exactly been front and center lately. There have been other regional hotspots that we've been focusing on, but I think it's worth to return to this issue because we're right at a period at the start of an election period in Israel. And also, I was just in Ramallah, and as well as Israel and in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and their talk there about elections in the West Bank. 6 months from now, they're doing a cabinet reshuffle. I think it's fair to ask whether it'll all unfold the way the PA leaders want. We'll have to see. Will Rami Hamdallah, the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister, actually continue saying in the Middle East there's nothing more permanent than that which is temporary? So we don't know. But I think to the extent that we look at this issue, it's not just the nexus point between policy and politics. We tend to look at the leaders. We look at Netanyahu and Abbas, and I'm sure we'll be doing things on the Trump peace plan this spring and the like, but not as much do we look at public opinion, which is where the people. Are the leaders really representing their publics? I think this is really a great opportunity to have here, I think, some of the, what I call, really cream of the crop, top pollsters who could really give us a sense. So I'm really delighted. We're joined by the following people. Right next to me is Nader Said. He's the president of the Arab World for Research and Development, a Palestinian firm that has conducted hundreds of surveys across the Middle East over the past 20 years. Tamar Hermann, a political science professor at the Open University of Israel and academic director of the Gutman Center for Public Opinion and Policy Research at the Israel Democracy Institute. And Dave Pollock, our own Dave Pollock, the Bernstein Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, where he focuses a lot on the Arab regional dynamics and related issues. He's the head of Project Fikra. So I think this is really, for me, as someone who's always fascinated by public polling data, what do we learn from this? What does it teach us about the current political environment that we're in? For me, it's like being a kid in a candy store. So I don't know about you, but I know I'm going to enjoy this session. So I will turn it over to Nader to be our first speaker.
Thank you. Good morning. No pressure. Candy store. Huh? Let's see how that goes. Okay, thank you for the invitation and thank you for coming. I'm very proud to be looking at an issue that's so close to my heart, and it's something I've been working on for the last 20-some years. And in Palestine specifically, we're very proud of the fact that we have been doing polling for the last 3 decades almost, which is not the norm in the Arab region. And we were able to spearhead, the various public opinion polling in the Arab world when, the conditions permeated and allowed for that. And as such, we try to create what's called, what I call at least, a culture of polling, which is part of a culture of democracy, basically. And in terms of methodology, we have worked very hard to improve research methods. And as David Pollock, who is the polling guru and the pope of polling, he gives grades and scores, and in his book, which is behind you, Slippery Polls, he gives us a 4 out of 5 stars. So we're good with that, at least for now. Worked with him like 25 years ago, going to Gaza, and he has so many jokes about that. It's not as much of a joke now, but that's the condition. Okay, so again, as David mentioned, it's very interesting what we do in polling, but one has to remember this cannot be isolated from all other contextual imperatives and conditions. So and things change as well, and it depends on wording, and depends on questions, and so on. So one has to be careful about taking this at face value. We just have to try to make sure it's contextualized. I'm gonna just, again, I'm gonna look at our latest poll that we just conducted in January, about 3 weeks ago, so it's fresh out of the oven. But also I'm going to do some trend analysis for the last, I don't know, 20-some years, sometimes 10 years, depending on the issue. And then in the discussion, you can ask about that as well. The polling that we do is in the West Bank and Gaza. We're still able to work in Gaza as well. It was difficult during the last 10 years or so. And we have to be very creative in how we do the polling, insisting on scientific rigor as well. You know, so our polling is reliant in terms of sampling on the Palestinian census, the latest of which is 2017. So we're very proud of that. We do random representative sampling. I'm not going into the details. We do face-to-face interviews in the two regions as well. So that's very, very general. If someone would like to have more insights on the methodology, I could say some more about that. I wasn't sure really what to talk about because I haven't been talking about public opinion polling or the Palestinian issue in Washington for a long, long time now. No one is as interested as they used to be. We knew what people were interested in. Now we're not. So it's a menu. I'm just providing. Some of them might like the beef. Some might like the fish. And so so I have it all for you. And I wasn't sure if I should start with the most relevant, least relevant issue, the Trump plan, deal, vision, because in the last 2 days we had a good discussion about this and we were unable to decide if it's the most relevant or the least relevant. So either way, it's number one. So I'm going to talk about the Trump plan, deal, and how people look at it among Palestinians. So deal or no deal? Okay. Of course, if people in Washington knew about the deal, we would know something about it. And as such, the question was more about, did you hear about it, basically? And as you can see, 17% say that they know about it, and 44 say we've heard about it to some extent, and 39 say we have never heard about it. So knowledge in itself is important, and I think that's, relatively speaking, that's a large percentage in terms of people hearing about it. That means that the local media and the official media specifically is talking about this already as is, and they're preparing the ground for the next phase of, if it is offered or if it's not offered. Whatever comes from the US, and especially whatever comes from Washington, is always suspicious, naturally, and we had experience. It's not coming from vacuum. And which made at least 72% of the people say that whatever this deal is, whatever this plan, vision, it will end the dream of establishing an independent Palestinian state. And only 4% say it will lead to a fair or just solution to the conflict. And it's interesting to see that about 1/4 really do not know or not sure, which in itself is indicative that they're still waiting to see what comes out of it. Whatever it is that people have heard about the PA's position, the Palestinian Authority's position, or Abbas's position for the most part, has led them to believe, at least 39% to believe that his position already is negative. What does that mean? I mean, if he's saying no already, we don't know if that means that they're saying yes, or maybe he's not going far enough in saying no. Or they already are critical of anything that comes from the PA as well as whatever comes from the US. So they don't really trust his no as a real no, maybe. And I think we've seen something come out yesterday from one of his top officials saying, well, maybe. So maybe that's what that means, that 39% say it is already negative. But what's interesting is that, again, 47% say we don't know. So that means that the public is smart enough to really say, yes, it's coming from the US. Yes, the PA says something about it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't hear about the details in terms of that. If the Palestinian factions, political factions, all of them basically should resist the deal or should they not resist it, 68%, 2/3 say that they should resist the deal, and 12% say they should not, and 20% say we don't know. And again, to me, at this stage, that's very interesting because to me, it's a split. When you have 1/3 saying, don't resist or not sure, that in itself is an indication when things come out, it becomes more proximate and it becomes closer and it becomes more detailed. So people come to be usually more pragmatic about such things. That doesn't mean that they will accept it. They might actually go the other way around, that more resistance will be to it. If they should resist it, how should they resist it? As always, we find that Palestinians would like to keep it open, and that Palestinians should use all means, including nonviolence, UN international, armed resistance, all of it should be used together and they have the right to do it. So that's what that says. And then 12% say only nonviolence, and 10% say UN international. So both of them together are 22%, and 12% say they should only rely on armed resistance to resist such a deal. Okay, if the Palestinians will be able to defeat the deal, or whatever it's called, again, I feel weird saying it's a deal. I don't know if it's a deal or anything. 51% say that Palestinians will be able to defeat it. These 4 million people without an army and without, that much confidence still until this point of time. And that in itself is very important because Palestinians have that feeling, actually. They're not broken. They really feel that they can influence things, and they had actually before. So 51% say they will defeat. But then again, another almost 50% say different things. They're either not sure or they say it will be imposed. And that is the opposite of what I just said. It's somewhat fatalistic. That if the US wants it, if Israel wants it, if the Arab countries want it, and maybe if the PA wants it, so most probably that's what we've seen before. So they'll impose something on the Palestinians. So again, it's an open question for the most part, but at least 51% are, defiant, Yeah. Again, what we know of is quote unquote what's called the peace process, which doesn't really exist. No negotiations, no deals, nothing has changed since 2000 after 5 years of the Oslo Accords. No final status agreements come across. So we're really living with a Palestinian Authority that is carrying a project that it cannot really carry because it's under occupation and it's without sovereignty and without solution to the final status issues, refugees, Jerusalem, borders, water, everything else. But in general, again, there are some things that are important in the peace process that I would like to share with you. Again, 60% after, since 1993 with all the Oslo implications, 60% now say that we're farther from achieving an independent state. 37% believe that we're closer to achieving an independent state, and 3% say they're not sure. Even with that, still 50% of the Palestinians are willing to say, well, we are willing to resume negotiations when we support it, but that has been a split, actually. Even in the best of times, there was always a split about yes, no, and the utility of having negotiations. Now, of course, everyone is disillusioned by whatever negotiations there are. There are either no negotiations or there are failed negotiations to achieve whatever Palestinians have in mind in terms of their goals. Lately, which has stopped for the most part now, the last few months, we had some attacks on soldiers and settlers in the West Bank. All of them, actually, were on settlers and soldiers in the West Bank. We asked Palestinians if they support such attacks. In total, in the West Bank and Gaza, 62% say yes. This has been a strong position among Palestinians that soldiers and settlers in the occupied West Bank are a fair target. Much less Palestinians believe in attacks inside of Israel. But what's interesting here is that a much larger majority in Gaza supports such attacks. So it's in Gaza, but what's going on really is in the West Bank. It's the other way around. In the West Bank, there is a real division about these attacks. Not everyone is in agreement, so 51% big difference. The opposite is true in terms of what's called the marches of return on the borders of Gaza, Israel now. It's totally the other way around. First of all, we have a majority saying we do not support such marches, which to me was a bit surprising, actually. Maybe not, But about 42% of the total say that they support such marches. In the West Bank, it's much higher than it is in Gaza. It's not just greener on the other side, but let them do it instead of us, They can do it. You know, so 50% of the West Bank say yes. Only 29% of Gazans are actually interested in these marches.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's real, you know, so they see the complexity, they see the details. It's not just presented on TV as a martyrdom or as just, you know, nationalist. There is more to it. Okay. Similar in that vein, you know, basically, we have asked about a long-term truce between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and you know, we gave the conditions in terms of, you know, easing the closure and you know, stopping the attacks on both sides and electricity and all of that. As you can see, 56% support, 37% oppose, and 7% don't know. But again, most interesting is that almost 70-some% in Gaza support that, much less in the West Bank. Our brothers who are victims there, but still, you know, they are, you know, for the national cause. So it's all these dynamics that are going on. Now I'm going to go into a different section of the menu, evaluation of leaders and to some extent institutions. And what we've seen in this regard is that in the last, it has been increasingly, as you know, as the evaluation of the peace process, negotiations, the full project that this PA, the Palestinian Authority, stands on, basically, and is based on, this project of peace and negotiations failing, the evaluation of the PA is also failing, but not only because of a failed negotiation, it's also for so many internal issues as well, services and corruption and all kinds of issues. So we look at evaluation of President Mahmoud Abbas, and we see that at this point of time, I mean, it's a three-way question. We have 21% saying positive, 39 fair, moderate, average, and 36. So Palestinians are very divided. It's more tilting to the more negative on him. But if you ask them a two-way question in terms of favorability, you will find it's more divided, like 40-some% approve, some if they're forced to be. But most, as you can see, are somewhere in the middle. That doesn't mean that Palestinians do not agree on his political, especially peace-related agenda. These are very different issues. Not very different, but somewhat different issues. So if we ask, when we ask Palestinians about some of the statements that he said during his last speech, I think in the UN, you know, for example, he said, we are against negotiation. We are not against negotiations. We'll keep our hands extended to peace. We'll never choose terrorism and violence. 60% strongly agree with this statement. So his agenda is still very present. His performance is not. And it's not just about him, of course. It's about Israel. It's about all Arab actors. It's about regional issues. It's more complex. It's not individual. We will not accept a sole American sponsorship of the negotiations. 77% strongly agree with his statement or agree. 72% agree or strongly agree that with convening an international peace conference based on UN resolutions. So the political agenda that he's throwing at people, and another one is nonviolence resistance, for example. The vast majority are also with him on that. So while they do not like what's going on, they still subscribe to his political agenda. One of the most recent issues is what David talked about is now the cabinet reshuffling. You know, Rami Hamdallah and his government are supposedly going out. They've been asked to resign. And a new government is being formed as we speak now. So this poll actually was one of the sort of the last stroke in a way. Really, it was just when we sent the polling results, immediately next day he was asked to leave, not because of the poll, but because of everything else. But it was helpful for the president and others around him to say, well, it's time for this government to go. So we're very proud, not very proud that he's going. We're very proud of the relevance of opinion polling. Did my subconscious say something now? It's the polling that I'm talking about. So anyway, as you can see, his polling is even lower, which was not the case. It was always that the prime minister does much better than the president throughout. You know, and his performance helps the president. It's not the other way around. But that came after the last stroke, which was reflective of, again, one does not have to, should not forget the power of Palestinian civil society. That this is a vibrant, strong civil society, regardless of this, you know, image of this dictatorship of Abbas. That's not true. We had, for the last 6 months, movements on the ground which forced the president now to actually ask for the resignation of this government and replace it with a new government. So, and as such, replace Rami Hamdallah, because his evaluation was really in terms of how he dealt with the social security issue that was going on the last 6 months, imposing a law that people don't want, and everyone resisted that. So, so in terms of, 56% supported basically the demands for change in the law, and 37% opposed. I think that's the one. That's it. Okay, just one last. I think people might be. We can talk about that later. Presidential elections, Fatah candidates. We can talk about them. But overall, 2/3 of Palestinians, and this is where I think the main indicative issues are and the main indicators are. If Palestine, the Palestinian society is heading in the right direction, wrong direction, as you can see, 2/3 is going in the wrong direction. Compared to last year, your living conditions, 55% say it's worse than last year, and 34% stayed the same. Only 11% are benefiting from the situation. Prospects for reconciliation, which is a major issue as well, still, 56% are pessimistic, and 37% are optimistic about a reconciliation. Occupation continues to be the main source of insecurity for Palestinians. Optimism in general, Palestinians, even under all these conditions, you still have about 50-50 optimism, pessimism. Usually that's very high, and maybe that's how we survive it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, Nader, thank you. I expected it to be sobering, but also had optimism too. So that's good, that's very good. Tamar.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Nader. So here's a spoiler for you. The answer to the question that was presented in the title is yes. Yes. So those of you who want to go home, that's my bottom line. Most Israelis do see the situation as the leaders do. There is a small minority who doesn't. But electorally speaking, it's a very small minority, and its ability to change the formal policy of Israel or even the psyche of the Israeli Jewish society is quite low, and we will run through the data in order to explain what's happening. As you know, we are going to have elections on April 9th, and there are lots of talking about the creation of a new center in Israel as opposed to the left-right kind of juxtaposition that we experienced in the past, but actually the center on issues related to the Palestinian problem, conflict, whatever, the center is much closer to the right than it is close to the left. In fact, the center is composed of many, many Israelis who were formerly leftists, but they were disillusioned, rightly or wrongly, and they moved rightward. So let's start. The main topics, I'll talk about the Israeli political map as of today, Israeli-Palestinian relations, government's priorities. This will show you that the peace issue is at the bottom of the national priority scale right now. Prospect for a breakthrough in the near future, almost nil. So let's start. This is a description, graphic description of the Israeli political bloc since the early 2000s to January 2019. And as you can see, the upper line presents the right side of the political map by self-definition. It means that people are identifying, or 62%, almost 2/3, are identifying themselves as being on the right. In the past, we gave titles and said, are you on the right, moderate right, center? But we decided not to do that, but just give them a continuum and say, 1 is left, 7 is right, where are you? So people were in a way liberated of giving a title to where they are, and they put themselves on the right, 25% in the center, 11% only on the left. It's a huge difference in comparison to where we were, say, at the beginning of the 1990s, when the Oslo process actually gained some momentum until it collapsed. Now, the best predictor for a Jewish Israeli person in terms of his or her political views is the level of religiosity. Okay, it may sound somewhat strange to Americans because you have devoted Christians on that side or on the other side, but in Israel the situation is not that. We still have a small plurality of secular people, self-defined, of course, around 56%. But they are not really secular. Certainly they are not secular in European terms. They are much more, I would say, traditionalist. They would perform Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. They will do Passover. They are not atheists nor agnostics or whatever. These two small groups, atheists and agnostics, come together 7% only. So there is a continuum. We have like 10% ultra-Orthodox, all of them on the right, 15% about Orthodox, and you do know that in Israel we have only Orthodox. We don't have almost Reform and Conservative Jews. The Reform and Conservative Jews are a bit more to the center than the average National Orthodox person in Israel, and we have the traditionalists. Now see this metrics. We asked each group to define themselves along the continuum of right, center, and left, and you can see that in most groups, people put themselves on the right. Of the ultra-Orthodox, 72%, of the Orthodox, 92%, of the traditional religious and the religious, 72 and 60%, secular, 28%, at the center 30%. So the secular are the only group that is almost equally divided between the three political camps. So if you take all the other groups on one hand and the secular on the other hand, and you put those in the secular camp on the right hand, you can understand why the prospects of having a very different government in the foreseeable future are quite minimal. Now, this is a very critical graph. It shows you the answers since 2003 to the present about what's the general situation in Israel. How well is Israel doing? Okay? As you can see, since 2003 to the present, there is a constant increase in the share of those saying that the overall situation of Israel is good or very good. We have over half of the population defining the situation as good and very good, and even more so, if you were not impressed enough with that, you can see the decline in the numbers of those who see the situation of Israel as bad or very bad. And the answer is clear. The economy is booming. Violence is down. So basically, people may not be happy with the way that the state is being run, but they don't feel any objective pressure on themselves or on the collective. We segmented the answers to this question by right, center, and left, as you can see. A very large majority of the majority who are on the right, 71%, say the situation is good or very good. At the center, almost half. And on the left, 11%, remember? 27% only say that the situation is good. And even those who are not saying that the situation is good, the plurality, 42%, said it's so-so. So basically, there is no sense of urgency to do anything. The situation is pretty okay. people are not under any pressure to change the situation or to change the government, even if they don't like Netanyahu, even if they don't like Israel policies. This is very different than what's happening on the Palestinian side. The Israeli Jewish political or the public is not under any real pressure now to make any change. And as far as Israelis are concerned, it can go like that for more 100 years. And this only tells you why Israelis are not running to the negotiation table anymore, because they're not going to pay, by their interpretation, any price for the continuation of the situation. We asked about the outgoing government performance. And as you can see, they 73% think that the conducting of Israel foreign relations by Netanyahu is very good. Okay, so they see all those presidents coming to Israel. They see Netanyahu is going everywhere and is welcomed in almost all European countries, certainly in the White House, but also in India, in China, in Russia, wherever. Number of countries with diplomatic relations with Israel. For example, from Africa, some Muslim countries, they have resumed their relationships with Israel, so he's doing pretty well. But also security is being dealt with. 2/3 are saying that he is performing quite well on that, and also economic stability. On other issues which are, in a way, secondary to the former three in terms of voting decisions, we see that less people think that he's doing very, very good. Now, we'll move to the Israeli-Palestinian relations. We asked what would have happened if Israel did not sign the Oslo Agreement. So people on the right thinks that the situation would have been better. At the center, the same. And on the left even, they say the same. In other words, even the left doesn't think that the situation would have been better. Okay, so the Oslo now is very low as a brand name for a policy. People are not missing Oslo in any way. Now we ask about responsibility for the failure to reach a peace agreement, and as you can see, on the right and the center, there is a clear majority of those putting the responsibility on the Palestinian side, and even on the left, 50% say it's on the two sides to the same extent. Even on the left, only a very minor minority, a very small minority, 14% only, are saying it's Israel. Okay, so basically, if you think that the other side is responsible for what happened, then you don't have any motivation to make peace with the other side. Okay, and as you can see, now these are two lines describing the support and the belief in the negotiations. The upper line is support, the lower line is belief. As you can see, they are very, very stable. People are supportive. There is a majority supportive of the negotiations, but talking doesn't hurt you in any way. However, only about 1/3 are hopeful that something may come out of this talking. So Israelis are really concerned when the talking is not being done, but they don't think that anyway something good will come out of it. I'll skip this. Now, the Palestinians have the right for an independent state. In the last couple of days, there was some assumption that, certainly they do have a right for a state. This is not the situation right now in Israel. The two-state solution and the idea that the Palestinians have the right for an independent state is not accepted by the right. Only less than 1/3 believe that the Palestinians are entitled for an independent state. There is a majority on the center and the left, but I have to repeat this once and again. Center and left are together something around 45% only. So half of the Israeli population do not think that they are entitled for a state. This is the graph describing the level of support for signing a peace agreement based on the formula of a two-state solution for the two people. Since 1994 to the present, there was an increase, and now we are below 50%. So the two-state solution for the two people is also a bad brand now in Israel. And as I said earlier, in some earlier discussion, the title should be changed in order to make people think about, again, is this what they want? Support based on the three political blocks. As you can see on the left, there is almost a consensus that this should be the end point, but on the right, only 25%, sorry, only 25% thinks that this should be the final aim. What will happen from the Palestinian standpoint if a peace agreement is signed? Then, as you can see, most Israelis, 74% Israeli Jews, think that this would not be the end of their hostile approach to Israel and to its Jewish citizens. Interestingly enough, look at the Israeli Arabs. They are also divided. They are also divided between those who say yes to those who say no. And I'll explain to you in a minute why. Because those who say no, it's because signing of a peace agreement with the Palestinian Authority will not resolve the problem of the Israeli Arab citizens. Okay, they even think that the Palestinian Authority may sell them for an agreement. Okay, most Palestinians have not come to terms with Israel's existence. Again, 80% on the right think that this is the situation. So why signing a peace agreement with someone who is not going to give up on their malintentions towards Israel? And this is why there is this demand that the Palestinians must recognize Israel as a prerequisite before the peace talks have started. This was not the case in the past. In the past, it was considered as part of the final agreement. But now, with Netanyahu's amazing success in persuading Israelis that this acknowledgement should come ahead of negotiations, it seems that he was very, very successful in that. And this is what I told you, the main issue that the Israeli government should focus on, as you can see, closing the socio-economic gaps, improving the economic situation, cleaning up corruption, and agreement with the Palestinians is sixth. Okay, so when we put 4 options, it would be 4. When we put 6, it would be 6. This is not a very urgent aim as far as the Israelis are concerned. To what extent is it important that the next government will work hard in order to renew negotiations? Well, the left thinks yes, but Jews in total, less than 50% think that it is a high priority for the next government. Prospects for a positive breakthrough in the negotiations in the near future, almost 90% say low or very low. So here you go. I think that we should stay here because, you know, this, the atmosphere here is more positive about...
Wait, I have some good news.
Okay. That's a picture I took in the Galilee. I liked it so much, the rainbow with the Israeli flag. So I think this gives you some hope, at least from the atmospheric point of view.
Thank you very much. Okay, that was sobering. Now we go to our own in-house pollster, Dave Pollock. Okay. Give us a regional, I assume.
Yes, I am. Yeah, thanks very much, all of you, for being here and for inviting me to speak about this. I do actually have some good news, and this is about the Palestinian-Israeli issue and related issues, but this is public opinion in the surrounding countries, not inside Israel or in Palestine, but in the Arab world. And I'm basing all of this on polls that I've been conducting in half a dozen or more Arab countries around the region, and I'll name the countries for you in just a moment, over the last 5 years, and particularly in the last 2 years. And even more particularly, the most recent poll, for which I have my own highly, I think, reliable data, is from November of last year, just a few months ago, November of 2018. The countries in which I've been conducting these polls are Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, and then the 5 countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council minus Oman. For some reason, I can't find a pollster who will do polls for me in Oman, but in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Qatar, I have pollsters who I think are doing some very good work. So you might ask yourselves, how do you manage to do polls in countries like this, which are closed societies in many ways, not democracies by any stretch of the imagination, and you're talking about very sensitive issues about religion and politics and Israel and all kinds of other possibly taboo topics? And the answer is pretty simple, in theory at least, in concept, and that is I do these polls very quietly. I do not ask for permission from the governments. I am using companies that are licensed in those countries to do commercial market research surveys about washing machines or shampoo or Coca-Cola or whatever. And in each case, I find a company that is willing to tack on 5 or 10 political questions to a standard commercial survey about consumer products or some other innocuous issues. And by doing it that way, I have found, and I've been doing this for a long time now, since 1990, for the US government and now for the Washington Institute, I have found that by doing this, you can do it. You can actually get very, I think, credible, counterintuitive in some cases, definitely not the party line, right? People are willing to say things that are not their government's official position or sometimes directly contradictory or critical of their government's official position, and sometimes to provide some pleasant surprises, showing that popular opinion is actually relatively moderate in many of these countries, surprisingly so. And that is mostly my message for you today, because on the issues that we're talking about, I'll skip forward to the bottom line and just tell you that Arab public opinion in the countries that I just named, those 8 Arab countries, actually supports a 2-state solution by a 2/3 majority, more than either Israelis or Palestinians today, or at least the Israeli Jewish public or the Palestinian public supports that kind of historic compromise. And on many other issues, Arab public opinion in these countries is, to answer directly the question of our session today, is in sync with the leadership's views on key foreign policy issues, not so much on internal issues. If you ask people about corruption, if you ask people about personal freedoms, if you ask people about economic development or social justice or fairness, in many of these countries, in the same poll, I find attitudes that are highly critical of their own government's performance. And that gives me a lot of confidence that I'm getting really credible answers, not just answers where people are telling you what they think is the politically correct or the easy thing to say. But I'm not going to talk about those internal issues, even though in every single one of these 8 Arab countries, the people say by large majorities, 70 or 80%, that internal political and economic reform is more important for their country right now than any foreign policy issue. That's what the people think. But now I want to talk about foreign policy, because that, I think, is what we're primarily interested in today. So the first thing to say is, what do people think about the United States? And this is where I think I'm different from all the other pollsters who manage to do polls in Arab countries, because I don't just ask, do you like American policy, or do you like President Trump? I do ask those questions. And I find, like all the other pollsters, that the people who approve of US policy or approve of President Trump, we're talking about single digits here in most of these countries most of the time. But that's not the important question. I know they don't like U.S. policy. But what I want to find out is, do they think that their country needs to have good relations with the United States, even if they don't like our policies? And what you can see here is that in most of these countries, a majority, or at least in many cases, a large minority of the public says, yes, it's important for our country to have good relations with the United States, even if we don't like it, and we don't like President Trump. Now, this varies over time, and as you can see on the charts, it varies by country. But in every single case, the percentage of people, this is the general public, not the elites, not the government, the percentage of the general public in each country who say that it's important to have good relations with the United States is much higher than the percentage of people who say that they like American policy or that they like the U.S. president. So that's a good, I think, a somewhat encouraging baseline from which to approach the question of whether the government's decisions in those countries to have good relations with the United States do or do not enjoy a substantial degree of popular support. Now, the next question that I want to ask, and actually this is before I get to the chart, so don't look at the chart, okay? Look at me, and I want to, thank you, I want to find out whether the publics in these countries agree with their governments that Iran is an enemy, that Hezbollah is bad. And the answer in every single case, except for one, and I'll tell you what that is in 30 seconds, in every single case, the answer is yes. The publics in these countries are in sync with the official position of antagonism toward Iran and antagonism toward Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies in the region, like, for example, the Houthis in Yemen. And here we are talking about overwhelming popular support for that official policy, 80 or 90%. In every single case. And that is also very important and not very well understood, I think. Many people think, oh, that's just the governments that don't like Iran or Hezbollah. No, it's not just the governments. It's actually the people in each of these countries. The exception is the Shiites in Lebanon. Not too surprisingly, the Shiites in Lebanon, where opinion is highly polarized on a sectarian basis, Shiites, Sunnis, and Christians, the Shiites in Lebanon, by large majorities, support Iran and support Hezbollah. But even there, in the last poll that I did, and I wrote a paper on this that attracted a lot of attention in the Arab media, almost no attention in our media, unfortunately, even among the Shiites in Lebanon, support for Hezbollah is dropping a little bit in the last year or so. And today, if you ask people in Lebanon, should Hezbollah actively confront Israel or not, amazingly, only 30% of the Shiites in Lebanon say that they want Hezbollah to actively confront Israel. In other words, bring on another Israeli-Lebanese war. That is not a popular position, even among Hezbollah's partisans in Lebanon today. Now, let's talk about the Palestinian issue and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more specifically. The first thing to say about this is whether or not this is a priority for the people in these countries. We know, I think, by now, that in the Gulf countries, the governments have shifted toward different priorities: Iran, Yemen, Syria, Al-Qaeda and Daesh, and so on. What we don't know until I do these polls is whether the people agree with that shift or not. And here again, the answer in the Gulf is yes. In the Gulf today, and this has been true at least for the last 2 years, and in many cases for even a few years more than that, in the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Qatar. The Palestinian issue is low on the list of foreign policy priorities. If you give people 5 or 6 priorities to pick from about Iran, about terrorism, about Yemen, about Syria, and so on, the Palestinian issue is usually at the bottom of the list these days in the Gulf countries. However, that is not the case in Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. In those 3 neighboring countries of Israel, where there, certainly in the Jordanian case, is also a large Palestinian origin population right there inside the country, the Palestinian issue is still number 1. Not by a lot. It might get around 30% support as the top foreign policy priority for that country. And other priorities share the rest. But it still has plurality support, roughly in the 30% range in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon as the most important foreign policy priority. Okay, now let's talk about the chart. Zeroing in on current topics of discussion. And here I have to say, I have to give credit to the Trump administration for making this issue more of a public matter of serious discussion. Whether Arab states should or shouldn't play a direct, larger role in trying to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And notice how the question is worded. I am asking whether people think that Arab states should offer both sides, that is, Palestinians and Israelis, should Arab states offer Palestinians and Israelis incentives to take more moderate positions. This is very good news. The public in every single one of these countries, in the Gulf and in the neighboring countries, by a 2/3 majority or more, says yes. Arab states should play a larger role, a new role, in Palestinian-Israeli peace talks, offering both sides incentives to take more moderate positions. This idea that is now a big part of diplomatic discussions has popular support. This is not just a Trump administration trial balloon or a government initiative on the part of MBS or something like that. This is something that the people in those countries actually support. As against that, if you ask people, okay, what about now, before there's a Palestinian-Israeli peace agreement? Should we have relations with Israel today in certain practical areas, like, as you see in the question, technology, counterterrorism, and containing Iran? Here you see a much lower number. It's not a majority. It's on the order of usually in the 20% range, or maybe a little higher in some countries, of the publics in these countries who say, yes, we should have relations, we should cooperate with Israel, we should work with Israel, even now, before there's an agreement with the Palestinians. This is a minority position, but this is not a negligible minority. It's interesting to note that the percentage is as high as it is, even without a peace agreement. 20%, roughly, or more in some cases, of the public, the general public, says, yes, let's have good relations with Israel on at least some issues, even without a peace agreement. And here, the interesting thing is that popular support for this is actually highest, not by a lot, but it's highest in those countries, Egypt and Jordan, that actually do have open, formal diplomatic relations with Israel. So there is a significant, not a majority, but a significant chunk of the public that says, this is okay. We should keep doing that. As against that, and here I'm coming almost to the end of my presentation, as against that, we still see that in many of these countries, there is a significant degree of popular support for Hamas. It's down a little bit in the last 2 years. For example, in Saudi Arabia in particular, support for Hamas among the Saudi public has dropped 25 points since 2015 to where it is today. And in Kuwait, which is one of the most anti-Israel and pro-Hamas Arab publics in the Gulf, maybe in the region, even there, the people who strongly support Hamas have dropped somewhat over the last several years. But the percentage of support for this organization, which denies completely the possibility of permanent peace with Israel, the percentage of support is still, on average, around 30–40% in many of these countries, even today. This does not contradict my earlier finding that a majority supports a two-state solution, but it points to the existence of a significant minority that is still hardline on issues of possible eventual peace with Israel. So I want to end with this note. What does this all mean? It doesn't mean that these governments are going to follow public opinion. There aren't elections in these countries for the most part. Lebanon is an exception where there's real uncertainty about the results of an election, but even there's less and less uncertainty about that, and Hezbollah is almost always likely to carry the day one way or the other. It doesn't mean that the public is going to put pressure on these governments in order to make peace with Israel or cooperate with Israel or follow American policy. But it does mean that if these governments decide that they want to support Palestinian-Israeli peacemaking, that they want to look for ways to cooperate with Israel, they are not going to face a huge popular backlash. Rather, they can count on a significant degree of at least passive popular support or acceptance for that kind of moderate policy. And this is a new and I think pretty encouraging trend in public opinion and also in the real world policy options that we all have to address these issues in the future. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Dave. There's really three fascinating presentations. So let me just ask our panelists an opening question. To Nader, I guess I would ask you, if someone who's looked at the polling data for a long time and saying, Abbas has reshaped public opinion on the Palestinian side. Would that be fair that he's had an impact in terms of a legacy on nonviolence, or is it something that when he goes, the views kind of snap back? How much of an impact has he impacted public opinion on the question of nonviolence, and how enduring is that shift that will continue? Because you said, there's support for his ideological agenda, but how much will it outlast him? And to Tamar, imagine Benny Gantz came to you, looked at your polls and said, maybe I should withdraw now. Listening to your polls, it seems that Netanyahu might, win with a huge percentage. Israeli life feels great. The 62% have self-identified of the Jewish public to the right. How could Benny Gantz mine your polls, read your polls, do a deep dive in your polls and saying, I just read Tamar Hermann, and despite, what it looks like, here are the opportunities for me in the Israeli election campaign. So, can the right just go to the beach for the next 3 months and, just decide not to campaign? Or does the center have a shot? And where is the shot? I didn't see, I realize that wasn't the topic here, and we're going to be doing, I believe we'll do an event before the Israeli elections and after the Israeli elections, but the whole issue of corruption in life, in other words, where's the center's opening to widen the political space for itself before the election? What data can it derive some support on. Maybe not in the numbers you gave us, but you have an encyclopedic knowledge of data. And Dave, I guess the question is, like, we've been looking at Israel's relations with the Arab world as a kind of a glass ceiling that, like, below the table, above the table, that there are things you could do, that are not public, and there's a perception that glass ceiling has kind of, gone higher. The table is kind of levitating a bit, but there's still a table, and you can only go up to a certain point. But given your polls, what could a leader from an Arab state do that would be public, that would not risk such a backlash if it took a step towards Israel? What are the sort of gestures? I mean, I assume we're not talking about having a flag in Riyadh, but are there public gestures that you say, hey, I've been doing these polls for a long time, and I see the shifts in the public, and here's where they could raise the table a bit and do more with Israel? What would that range, that zone be that they could do in this split screen world? So Nader, over to you. You could do it from the table if you like, as you wish.
Okay. The Palestinians have given Abbas the majority of votes in the 2005. It's been a long time now, elections. And that was based on the premise that he is the man and the leadership that will bring about a state through negotiations and through nonviolence. And with that, Palestinians have given our friends in Israel also Fayyad, who is a peace-loving man. So it couldn't have been better than that. There is no other way. There is no Palestinians, combination of Palestinians could be Abbas and Fayyad in terms of true beliefs in nonviolence, negotiations, two-state, and so on. So while Abbas's impact is lasting because Palestinians have always been divided on the best means of dealing with the occupation, from the most violent to the most non-violent and in between, and depending on time. Of course, his sort of ideology became much more important because he was given that chance. He didn't deliver. That, however, did not impact opinion polling. It didn't really. Still, we see the same levels of support for negotiations for the last 20 years, about 50-some%. But we see change in terms of the utility of peace and negotiations. So there was a time when 70%, like around the signing of the Oslo Agreement and immediately after that, where 75% would say it is leading to a Palestinian state. Now, of course, less than 20% would say that. So the question is not an ideological issue, and it's not an issue that Palestinians like this or that. It's a reality, it's a context. And as long as the occupation is there, Palestinians will have different views on this. So it all depends. The Israelis have not given Abbas anything, basically, to work with. And actually his leadership, his ability to rule, was totally compromised. As the way the PA was established, it was established only for 5 years for final status issues to be resolved. But then now everyone, which is the common myth everywhere we go, especially in the US, that as if we're dealing with two states. Of course not. You have a PA that's fully besieged and under the Israeli occupation. So whatever he does, it's under that ceiling, which is a very low ceiling, and actually it's a compromising ceiling, because if you come to Ramallah, if you were in Ramallah the last 2 weeks, you would see Israeli jeeps running around Ramallah, which is the center of the PA, where his house is and where his compound is, circling around it and arresting people and attacking homes and so on. So there is, I think his legacy will continue depending on what he leaves behind him. If his time is over and he doesn't deliver anything to the Palestinians, actually it's the other way around. Palestinians see him as cooperating with Israel for security coordination, preventing hundreds maybe of attacks against Israelis, which to some is collaboration. with the occupation. That's not really changing its shape or face, or, you know. So what Israel is sort of utilizing in the Abbas reign governance is, and it's a very complex issue because it relates to international funding and other Arab region conditions. That what's going on now is that Israel is using this opportunity of a prolonged Abbas and a prolonged no negotiations period to achieve what we see in Israel now, which is, to us, maximum occupation with maximum normalization. It's an occupation, but without the name. You know, it's not these are two states. You know, Palestinians have government, they have institutions. It's a facade, it's not real. You know, every move, everything in our life is fully controlled by Israel. That doesn't mean that we don't have agency, because I'm here. And we're still going to schools, and we're still going to work, and we're still struggling and doing things about it, and eventually we keep the optimism and the hope, you know. So again, Abbas, yes, but not forever. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tamar.
Well, Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz is the new white hope of the Israeli center and a bit of the left. We don't know what he thinks about critical issues. He gave one speech in which he was very careful to say this and that, yes and no. He didn't put forward any clear message, because he acknowledges that basically Likud, by the very recent polls, still gets something around 30, 32, and he gets something around 20 to 22. In order to become the next prime minister, he has to merge with Yesh Atid, at least. He actually drinks the votes of the left rather than drinking the votes of the right. And Likud was very smart. I mean, it is painful to me to say that. To elect a very good list in the primaries. The list is composed of people that are in many respects the functional equivalents of Benny Gantz. Like Yoav Gallant, who was supposed to be the chief of staff, and Gantz was chosen because there was some corruption there. So Benny Gantz is more of a myth than a person, a three-dimensional person, and I suppose that he still seriously consider the option of becoming the next Netanyahu's Minister of Defense. So he's very, very careful not to say that he would never sit in a Netanyahu government even if he's indicted. Okay? He said something and then immediately he said the reverse version of that. He started to talk about another unilateral withdrawal, and then everyone said, oh, okay, again, a transfer of Jews from the West Bank. So he corrected himself. He's in constant process of self-correction, which doesn't help him to become an alternative to Netanyahu. So Likud may survive without Netanyahu eventually. I mean, we already see Gideon Sa'ar and others which might replace him at the end of the day. So now the question, and the list that Benny Gantz is putting on the table these days is composed of people totally unknown to the Israeli public, like a TV anchor woman who actually left the Israeli TV about 10 years ago, and She now speaks on behalf of becoming vegan, and the head of the Israeli Electricity Authority, and no one with any political experience, because he wants not to be contaminated by the bad image of politicians in Israel. But being a politician is a profession. You can't immediately translate human capital or experience.
Not in this country.
Exactly.
Well, we are still a bit different. But maybe you'll regret in your upcoming elections.
Sorry.
So what I'm saying is that right now it's a bit of a hot air balloon. I'm not sure that he really threatens the Likud reign, maybe not Netanyahu, but others. So I wouldn't think that there is a contradiction between the structure of opinion which I presented with his ability to survive, because we don't know whether he is capable of really surviving 4 years in the opposition if he doesn't join a next right-wing government. He came out of the nowhere after losing like $5 billion in some kind of a startup. He wasn't very successful as a businessman. He's a very nice person. He looks fantastic. He has these blue eyes. You should see the large, the large placard with only half of his face. I don't know who is the designer, but his eye is turquoise, like very, very charming. And it's all dark green and black, the colors. He didn't take any of the national colors. So it's someone that we really don't know how committed he is to his political career, how capable he is, and is it not kind of celeb personality that would not survive the hardships of the Israeli political
So just
scene.
following up for one quick second, because for those who aren't following this story, we think that maybe as soon as next week, the Attorney General in Israel, Avichai Mandelblit, will come out with what they call a pending indictment, which means that here what it looks like they want to indict, but the Prime Minister is entitled to a hearing, and that could take another year. And what Tamar is saying, if I understand her right, based on this interview coming out tomorrow in Yediot Achronot, but they've already given excerpts of it, is that the reporter tries to pin them down when you said you won't sit with the Prime Minister who is indicted. What phase of the indictment? Are we talking about what could happen next week? Or are we waiting for a year from now in the final indictment after the hearing? So he's trying to keep it vague, but he made clear that it was really talking about the next phase, and thereby opening the door really to sitting with Netanyahu and maybe ostensibly, I guess, becoming his defense minister or having some senior portfolio. And as Tamar is one of Israel's leading pollsters, I'm just curious, the conventional wisdom is if there is an indictment, Netanyahu could lose 5 seats, which is significant, 4 to 5.
Yeah.
And that's so if he's, remember, we're talking about only in the Israeli politics, it's all about a coalition getting to 61 out of 120. If you're at 30, in American standards, that's a quarter. 25% of the polls is not great. But in the Israeli system, because of the coalition dimension, that's good. So do you subscribe to that he could lose 4 or 5? Or it depends if it's for bribery or not for bribery? I mean, do you?
After the primaries, I'm not sure that he's going to lose 4, because people will say, okay, he might be indicted, then maybe he'll go to jail. But we have a very good list of candidates.
The buzz coming out of the primaries this week was really good, including the fact that someone who Netanyahu didn't want, this fellow Gideon Sa'ar, who was like self-imposed exile for 4 years and was seen as a kind of a smart, squeaky clean guy, has reemerged and was number 4 after Netanyahu, 5 if you include Netanyahu on the list. So I think that the media buzz is that Netanyahu, that the Likud acquitted itself well and purged some of its more raucous characters and the like. Okay, Dave.
By the way, they're all Ashkenazi on his list, besides 2 women who are also non-Ashkenazi. So you get 2
on
for
the
1.
Likud list.
On the Likud list.
Yeah, okay. Dave.
Okay, thank you, David. That's a great question. Where is this ceiling or table or whatever you want to call it for Arab normalization with Israel vis-a-vis public opinion in these countries right now? And what can we look for or hope for or push for in the future? So I would say three quick things about that. Number one, it varies by country. And if you look a little carefully at the numbers that I showed you, I would not expect or push for anything from Kuwait, for example, where popular opinion is decidedly negative on peacemaking with Israel, and very positive toward Hamas by regional standards and so on. And that's even though the Kuwaitis as a whole, the Kuwaiti public as a whole, hates Iran and Hezbollah just as much as, or almost as much as the other Gulf publics do. So, on the other hand, if you're looking at Saudi Arabia, for example, you have an opposite case, a better case from the standpoint of normalization, where even though support for cooperation with Israel before a peace agreement is still low, it's climbing year by year, a little bit, a little bit, a little bit more. And so there you might expect that the government could get away with, let's say, not just letting Air India overfly Saudi territory, but maybe even El Al someday, before too long. But the second point is more important, and that is that this depends on the circumstances. In the context of an active peace process, there is tremendous scope, again, from the standpoint of popular opinion, for Arab overtures toward Israel. 60+%, sometimes 70+% in every single country say that Arab states should provide both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, with incentives to take more moderate positions. But that presupposes that there is some kind of negotiation, or at least some kind of prospect of deal-making between Israelis and Palestinians that they could support. Now, in that context, it's not just a matter of what they can offer to Israel, it's what they could offer to the United States. Because in that context, it seems to me that if I were the Trump administration looking at this and saying, how much can I try to involve Arab governments in supporting or at least not opposing a peace plan or a compromise or a vision or some kind of American initiative to bring the Israelis and the Palestinians together, I think that the answer is there's a lot of room for that. There really is. Arab governments could at least offer quiet support or just shut up about it, not oppose an American proposal without risking a gigantic popular backlash. Now, of course, it depends on the details and the timing and a lot of other things, but that's the general picture. One last thing I want to say about this is that there is one area where there is more scope for, in terms of popular attitudes, there is more scope for gestures of goodwill than ever before, and it's climbing a little bit year by year. It's still fragile, it's still small, but that is interfaith relations. That is attitudes or overtures toward not Israel maybe, but toward Jews and Judaism. And if you ask these Arab publics, and I think I'm the only pollster who dares to do this, if you ask them whether or not Islam should be interpreted in a more tolerant and moderate and modern direction, that's a question that I've been asking for the last 5 years. What you see is that support for that proposition is going up, little by little by little. And in Saudi Arabia, in the last few years, it doubled. Now, it doubled from 15% to 30%, okay? It's still only a minority of the Saudi public that says, yeah, I think it's a good idea to interpret Islam in a more tolerant, moderate, and modern direction. But that's an improvement from this standpoint. And I think there, if you look for gestures that don't get into the politics, but into the religious dialogue arena where there is some progress, and I think you can expect that there would be some significant popular acceptance of that.
Questions, people, right over there. Yes, sir. Please identify yourself too. Here it comes.
Traub, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service. And I'd like to ask our two pollsters, Mr. Said and Ms. Hermann, as a result of your polling, I'm not sure I heard this type of a question asked, but do you think you might be able to answer the question from both sides of the people you spoke to? What would you like to see or have to see in a final deal between Israel and the Palestinians that will bring an unconditional end to the conflict? You know, is there considerable overlap or not? Do you feel you have enough type of data where you could maybe have a stab at answering this thing for unconditional requirements?
Okay. You know, maybe we'll take a couple at a time. I think I see another hand out there. All right, so let's go with this one. Nader, you want to start? Or Tamar? Go ahead.
Should I go first?
Go ahead, Tamar.
Well, the first thing is a recognition of the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish nation state in the Middle East. This is now a prerequisite for everything. No right of return under any conditions of the Palestinian refugees, and undivided Jerusalem.
Under Israeli rule or just undivided?
Is it physically undivided or politically undivided? Two separate things.
Undivided. I mean, thus far, the public discourse has not gotten into these details. The more optimistic thing is that the definition of this undivided Jerusalem is much smaller than the Jerusalem as we know it right now. For example, the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem, like Sheikh Jarrah and others, are not considered by most Israelis as part of this undivided Jerusalem, okay? So certainly the west side and the old city and Haram and Sharif and Temple Mount. All the other issues in Jerusalem can be, discussed. Basically, there is a strong opposition to
even the inner neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah. In your view, that
everything that has an Arab name for Israeli Jews is not part of our Jerusalem. We checked it.
Except for
Abu Tur. Sheikh Jarrah may go. But that's it has an Hebrew name already. So we rename it. But basically, it's a smaller Jerusalem than the Jerusalem that we are referring to. But the right of return, total negation of the right of return, and the recognition of Israel as, and of course the large block of settlements. I mean, the large settlement blocks. I mean, they are ready to give up on but not returning to the 67 border as it was, because basically, if we look historically, there is nothing, sacred really about the Green Line. Yeah. So some accommodations might be. Borders is not a problem. Water is not a problem, but right of return is, and the Jewish character.
We tested the idea of land swaps.
Yeah.
High support.
People are very, very, very eager to get rid of the small triangle and have less Israeli Arabs within.
The courts might not feel the same way, but we're talking about public
it's against
opinion.
the law. You cannot really, give up on 20% of your population.
Exactly.
But if we are dreaming here, it's a very lovely dream for many. By the way, it started with labor. I mean, now we talk much about Lieberman being the strongest supporter of the swap, but it started with people from labor.
Yeah, Nader, do you want to?
I feel like I'm in a negotiations room more than any time before, which I always refuse to be. So now the Palestinians coming out and, no way, it's, So anyway, again, Palestinians are very clear on what, again, they want
Right
or not
of
want.
return.
The right of return.
All of she said the opposite.
Undivided Jerusalem.
No blocks.
Recognition of Palestine as an independent state. So actually, now more serious. Palestinians have recognized Israel. Israel did not recognize Palestine yet. So that's already, for the Israelis, it's a check. The Jewish state issue is just what do you call it when you have عقدة بالمنشار شو عقدة بالمنشار? It's just a derailment. It's.
Do you see any shift, though, in Palestinian public opinion on this
It
question?
depends how you frame it. Most Palestinians do not care what the Israelis call themselves. If that's what the Israelis, secular, non-secular, if that's what they want, I think most Palestinians do not care. But again, it's not about dividing the issues. For the Palestinians, you have to get to a final status issue. And the closer we get to a solution, even if it doesn't meet all the demands, it will never meet all the demands. Some Palestinians still feel that it's all of Palestine, historic Palestine. In our hearts, I don't think that any Palestinian would think otherwise. But will they compromise by, accepting 22% of the land? They would. They've already said that many times. So how do you start the discussion? If you started 1948, then it becomes a very different, very asymmetrical sort of relation. So while the vast majority of Palestinians have come to believe that it's okay, it's acceptable to have a two-state solution in the West Bank and Gaza, which is only a small part of Palestine. And I think, more and more, depending on the package. So in terms of Jerusalem, for example, again, like the Israelis, it all depends, how in practice. I mean, if you talk about large concepts, of course people are going to say, of course not, but then if you just bring it out and you have true leadership behind it, the closer you come to a solution, the more pragmatic people will become, in general, on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian. It becomes more concrete, it becomes more understood. Just to give you an example of, Dave knows about this example, I talked to him about it many times. When I ask my Palestinian brothers in Lebanon, in the polling that we do, or in London actually, or in the US, about Palestine, I would ask them a question about favorability. And favorability, like 90% would say, of course, all of Palestine, and of course, right of return. Then I ask them a question, do you really think it's feasible? Then it would be 20%, 15%. So this gap analysis between favorability and between realism is what needs to be looked at. And that's why the closer you are to the space where this dynamic is going on, the more compromising you become. And that's why many Israelis who live in Israel are more compromising than Jews that I see here, some Jews that I see here, or some actually non-Jews that I see here, more than anyone else, okay? Same thing with Palestinians. When you ask Palestinians in Jordan about favorability, it would be like 60%. Realism, about 40%, because they can call, they can come and visit, they see that, okay, it's Palestine, it's nice, it's a dream, it's ideal, but there are traffic jams, and there are some people who don't do their job well, and there is pollution, just like any other place. Then you ask Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and the gap is much lower between desirability and between realism. And that's why this momentum, and again, this is not a lack of insistence on justice, and this is it is an occupation. No Palestinian would tell you otherwise. No Palestinian would accept, an occupation that's going more and more towards full-fledged colonialism in the West Bank, but without the name. It's going to come back all the time. And again, if you have neighbors living side by side, and as Tamar was saying, the Israelis more and more, for objective reasons, are feeling more, an improvement in their economic conditions, in their living conditions, in non-violence, while they're neighbors who live side by side, work with each other, not with each other, but Palestinians work for the Israelis mostly in settlements and the Israeli market. Their living conditions are deteriorating. It's the flip side of it. You cannot have good neighbors who are going in different directions. It's not going to work out. It is our responsibility. It's the responsibility of people who are in the leadership, in the elite. And again, I understand the politics. And yesterday there was a meeting when people were saying people who are on the ground, like even the military, are much more responsible actually in many of their decisions in relation to the West Bank and how do they deal with it, than politicians who are trumping the trumps of war, whatever it's called, to get more votes from the right, the predominantly right wing, not leaving any space for a time when things were different in Israel. So there is nothing that makes, just because Israelis don't care or ambivalent about what's going on in the West Bank, it doesn't mean that the occupation is going away for the Palestinians.
Okay, I think that Nader put his finger on something crucial, which I hope pollsters really internalize. And Dave, given what he said, I think at the start of Dave Pollock's presentation, he has already internalized is this gap between what the public desires and what it feels is feasible to live with. So the gap between desirability and feasibility, I hope, and this will be, I think, very helpful to us in Washington, the more pollsters, Tamar, Nader, Dave, are really able to mine that gap between what do you want and what do you think is realistic, the more we'll have a better sense of attitudes, because everyone is always going to want the moon. Sure. That's a given. But what's really needed is to peel that onion and to make sure that we understand the same people who said maybe they all want the right of return, but then how many feel it's realistic, the numbers drop to 15 to 20%. We don't always see in Washington that gap between what people want versus what they can live with. I think that's a good place to end. We try to end these things on time. So I want you to join me and thank really the three pollsters for a great presentation.